Things I mentioned before that how many here love painting and they took up wood carving so they had something to paint? Right.
I mean, partially.
So it's basically the opposite. You took up wood carving because you like wood carving and working with wood, and painting was not part of the thought process at all. And that's typical of most wood carvers. They kind of avoid it or hate it or whatever. So, or hopefully we can get you excited about painting a little bit. To start off, I'd just like to give a little bit of background. My wife used to teach us a couple times. I don't know if you took that class, remember what she told you and kind of forget what I told you. She was the pro. Give you a little background on her. Early 2000, after almost 30 years of teaching elementary class school, she quit and went back to college. She took all the classes up at BSc in the art class, and then went a year at UND and got a major in art. Came back here, and the next year BSc asked her if she would teach up there, so she taught up there a class for 3 or 4 years. So that's her background. So I want to show you my first painting. When I first started carving, this is one of the earlier ones that I painted. I used thick, heavy paint. This has about 3 coats on it. That's what I thought it took. And after that, I was able to talk her into painting most of my carvings for several years, and a lot of my fellow carvers didn't appreciate it because they didn't have a spouse to paint it for them. But anyway, then I started painting my own carvings, and that's more or less how I learned, by a seat of pants. But as I made mistakes, I could run upstairs, ask the professor, what did I do wrong? She told me, went back, corrected it. So I always had that resource available to me. That's kind of how I learned from mistakes. And there are still mistakes that I'm learning from, but I don't have the solution to them yet anymore. So anyway, just to give you a little bit of background how I learned. Okay, I gotta make sure I expanded her notes that she had before. And I do have a few print-offs of the notes that we handed out before when she was teaching. But just to give you a little bit better idea of the facility I have in my couple rooms downstairs is, I counted up, I got 76 different tubes or bottles of paint, acrylic paints. I don't think most people have anything close to that. That's not counting the watercolors and oil paints, which I don't touch hardly at all. And I rough counted, this is kind of counting by tens, I got probably about 200 paintbrushes. I don't know if anybody comes close to that either. So I got a lot of things to work with. Just like carving, what I'd like to reemphasize as I talk about what I do, what I learned, painting is almost like carving. You can take a class from one person, they'll have their technique. You take a similar class from another person, they'll have a little bit different technique, and then you develop your own kind of technique. Painting is very similar. If you read, I mostly look at Wildfall magazine, and all those great paint carvers, everyone approaches their painting of their birds slightly different, so there's no consistency. There's kind of a general trend, but that's about it. So the bottom line is, when this is all over with, you got to go back and find out what works for you, do some practice on practice boards, and develop your own ideas. The other thing I'd like to let you know, that you spend a lot of time carving, and you need to spend a fair amount of time painting it. If you do a lousy job of painting your carving, it's really going to increase the quality of what you spent all your time carving. Vice versa, if you spend a lot more time painting that, taking your time, it's going to improve your carving. So one of the things, I don't know if many people know Josh Googie. He was here a few years ago, stayed at my house. Him and his dad, both we had here, have won the top prizes at award show out in Maryland, which is the premier wildfall carving in the world. So if you win that, you're on the top of the list. And what Josh said now, the carving is getting so good that the determination of first place or not is not the carving anymore, because they're all so good. It's the little details in the painting now that is separating the first place and the second and third. So it's moved from the carving into the details of the painting. There's lots of tools out there. We'll start with brushes. And you might not be able to see this very well, but there's several different kinds. There's a round filbert, flat, fan, angle, many other ones. Filbert is somewhat of a rounded tip. After painting a long time, this is one I kind of go to now for my general painting, but that might not be your favorite. It didn't start out to my mind. There's a slanted one, kind of like a house trim brush a little bit. Kind of handy sometimes to get on along the edges, but I find my filbert works good. Then the other most common one is just a rounded one to a point. I have several real fine ones that you do details with. Well, that's not a very fine one. I've got fine ones. You barely can see the tip. They come in some with just a few hairs in them and up to several. What I found about doing detail work, I started trying to do like the eyebrows and stuff with a very small, fine, a few brush, hair brush. You dip it in your paint, you dab it off, and you start making that line. You only get very just started, and you got to dip it again. And I have trouble making a nice straight line when I have to keep on repeating. So what I've been doing lately, and I don't have a good favorite one, but this will give you an idea, going back to this, I use a round one and make sure it's got a good point, but smaller than this, that can hold a little bit more paint in it. I found that handy, so I can make a little bit longer line without running out of paint quite so fast. But you might find out going back to the narrow ones or whatever might work for you. I got one funny one here. There's a lot of different kinds, kind of a brushy one. So there's lots of different styles out there. They come in lots of different quality and different hairs. The Saber's the ultimate, they claim. I couldn't tell you the difference right now. I'm not that much of an expert, but they come in different synthetic or different hairs. So find one you want. And the bottom line for all your tools and paint, I'll re-emphasize this, just like your tools, you pay more or less what you get. So don't go to a craft store and buy craft paint. Buy real artistic quality paint. And there's different qualities of that too, but the more you pay, I know it's more expensive, like everything else, your tools, you won't regret it. So buy what you feel comfortable buying, just avoid the real cheap stuff. Oh, then the other thing about these paintbrushes, if you look at them, they'll have a number on them, and that's the size of the paintbrush, and they go, this is a number 6, this is a number 2, so they go all the way from 000 up to, what was some of the bigger ones? 30, so they get pretty big. I got a few paintbrushes that almost look like I would use to paint my house with. So
where do you get brushes?
I either go to Hobby Lobby or Michael's. Another, probably a good place if you're buying a lot of stuff is Blicks. You can go on the web if you buy them, and they've got tons of stuff there. And there's probably other places, but a lot of artists, I think, will buy out of Blicks. I think that's where she started buying stuff when you're buying a lot of quality. I find it handy just to see what's out there and what's available, but when you go buy a brush, look at the tip of it, see if it's a nice tip of it. Sometimes it might be bent over or out of place, or the tip might be bent over, so it might be a good quality, but something happened to that tip at the store or whatever. So the other thing you should do is you label your brushes. If you use gesso, talk about that a little bit later. I advise you, my wife did, label it and only use your brush with gesso. It's a little harder on your brush. If you use oil, have your oil brushes separate from your acrylic. If you do watercolor, keep those separate too. Cleaning, very important. The best thing is to just use good old water and soap. This is my soap dish next to my tub in my laundry room, and I just brush back and forth. Don't jam it in there. Do more of a rubbing process and clean your brush. Do that. Here, your plate and knife. If you're mixing your different colors, or if you add water to it, you need something like this. I don't advise using your paintbrush to mix them with. You just get so much into your brush, and it just clogs up your paintbrush. So these come in all different sizes and shapes. The most common is something along this line, and I use it almost all the time in painting.
What did you call it?
Palette knife, P-A-L-E-T-T-E.
Palette.
Palette knife, palette knife. So then, when you're mixing it, this is a kind of a common standard one to mix it in. I started mixing stuff in here. Got a couple of them. Personally, I don't like these anymore. They're so small to mix inside here. I've got a whole pile of these, and what I use now, of course, I've got all this available to me, is this mixing paper body. It's kind of a smooth paper. Instead of buying tablets like this, if you haven't done that, probably the best thing is to buy a roll of freezer paper. It's probably pretty cheap. Don't use wax paper that you have in your kitchen closet. You scrape off some of that wax getting in your paint, but freezer paper is cheap. You just rip off a foot of it and it goes forever. So when I'm mixing, I just use one of these here sheets, keep on doing different corners of it and mix it to 2 different paints or 3 or whatever I'm doing. So this is something like this, or freezer paper works real well. I know some people will use paper plates or a plastic plate or something, works real good, and just wash it off when you're done. When you're making certain things, and that's why I brought this here guy with me. If you're trying to put his eyes in, painting those are a pain in the butt because you're going to mess them up. Or like this one, I got little flower type things on his scarf. So when you want little round dots like that, well, it works real well. I wouldn't necessarily suggest buying these. They come in different sizes of round tips, but they work great. You can just dip this in the solid paint and make dots wherever you want it, if it's an eye or on your scarf or whatever. So it depends on what size of dot you want, which one you use. Toothpicks work pretty good, very cheap. Ultimately, I found these work a little bit better, but I'm not suggesting to buy these, but if you're doing a lot of it, these would be something you might want to invest in. Always got to buy some new tool, you know. Don't put your brush in some kind of water container while you're going in between your process, because you're going to smash your chip all the time. I mean, you can do that if you're just doing it real quick, but you don't want to leave it in there. They have something like this that I kind of like, because you can stick your brush here and it holds it in there. This actually came about twice as tall, and so a lot of my brushes wouldn't reach the water, so I cut it off and kind of glued it to a shorter length, but that's what I use. Another, if you're mixing a lot of paint, you want some type of either a color wheel, and unfortunately I'm not much of a color expert. I know someone that took a lot of color theory in college and helped me out on this, but what I ended up doing, since I had all these resources available to me, is this is kind of ended up to be my go-to one when I'm trying to figure out what to mix. So if you want to mix a particular blue, for instance, it tells you what colors and amounts to mix, and you can kind of see it. So you can go through different shades or whatever. So this is kind of my go-to. So if you're just doing a caricature or something like that, you're not trying to match a particular color. But if you're doing birds or fish or something that's realistic, especially birds, which I try to do, you want to get as close as possible of what that real bird's color is. It might be a goldfinch, but yellow there's lots of yellows out there, so you need to know which yellow to use or mix to get the right yellow. The other thing, just to give you a hint, when you're doing birds, some birds change colors from spring mating time to later summer and the winter, so it depends on when that particular carving is supposed to represent, might be a different color. So lots of things to remember. Now this probably applies mostly to birds or maybe fish, is a carving holder. My favorite one is a commercial one. If you see, if you're acquainted with Frank Schultz, this is more or less what he uses, is a commercial one. This is a heavy weight, holds up your carving, and it comes with different sizes of screws that you can put in there. You can take it out or string it, so you can hold it while you're painting it instead of holding it with your hand. That's the other thing I'll mention that's on my list someplace. If you're, especially like birds, I've found is I use a cotton glove to hold it sometimes. If you don't, I've had this happen twice to me, where I've got too much hand oil on a part of the bird, and it was very difficult to get paint to stick right in that area. I had to keep on going over and over it. So I'll try to avoid handling it. So cotton glove, something like this, really avoids that issue. Then the last thing I use almost constantly is this deluxe hair dryer. So if you have a bad hair day, this will fix it. So almost anything, it doesn't have to be big and powerful like this, but because I put this on pretty low, but if you're doing acrylics, you can paint it, you can hit it for just a few seconds with a low heat, and you can paint some more, keep on going. So having some type of a dryer helps a lot. So. Okay, I'm going to talk about acrylics. I'm not going to talk about oils at all. The only one I know that does any with oils, if anybody else let me know, but Bob Petticoat does some painting with oils. So if you got questions on oils, check with him. I do have oil paint, but I don't do anything but look at them on the shelf. So, the interesting thing about oil paint is they basically, two kinds. They'll come in a tube or a bottle. Tube is probably the most common one around here. And I think when I read magazines, articles, they'll use some type of a tube type. There's nothing pro or con on either one, but again, just like everything else, what you pay is what you get. Although this is this is titanium white, you can buy cheap titanium white or expensive, and basically you don't know the difference because it's a matter of how much pigment is in it or not. Just like house paint, you can buy some cheap house paint and expensive, and you don't know until you use it, and if it fades or cracks years later or not. There's basically three types of paint that you can buy. Most of it's opaque, and some different brands are hard to find what they are on the label and stuff. I've got a few that I have to dig real hard to find it, but Liquitex is one of the easier ones I found to at least find what's in there. It says opaque right here. I'm not sure what that means, a series 1. That's, I think, the top line. I know there's a series 2. And then the other thing that they talk about is light fastness. That's basically if it fades or not. And this is excellent, and I know they have some that are the next lower one. I've got a few of those. So those are things to look at. The other thing to look at when you're looking at paint is this is opaque. Most of your paint you're going to find is opaque, and I think you know what that definition of that is. This one is translucent, and I tried to bring an example of, this is one I found that is transparent. So transparent is the one you can see through the easiest or not. So for instance, if you want to see one way of doing it, if you want to see some of the wood texture or whatever in your carving, instead of putting a heavy coat and covering it up and making it look more like it could be plastic or something. If you want to see that, a little bit of that detail, more of a transparent or translucent will let more of that shine through, which I kind of like too. So those are your options out there. The other thing to note, and maybe it doesn't make any difference, there's lots of, for instance, yellows out there, and on here, like this one, it will say a single pigment. So there's only one pigment that is in here that made it, and that it give you the number of that pigment, where this one has a mixture of pigments in it. So I don't know if that matters or not, but just be aware that there's some single and multiple ones. So then the other thing to be aware of, because these were in my wife's notes, when you're painting, when it's wet, it's going to look much darker than when it dries. So be aware of that. As it dries, it's going to lighten up a little bit, which may be what you want, maybe it's not. Just be aware of it. And there's many kinds of red, yellows, and blues. There's from reds, from orange red to blue reds. I took a whole pile of different reds that I had and put a little dot, because I didn't know exactly what they looked like, and I wrote the different names beside them. So maybe that doesn't matter to you what red you want to use, but if you're looking for a particular shade or something of red, there's lots of variation out there, just like all the other colors. I mean, red is not just red anymore. If you're doing something like what I do, like either of my examples up here, it takes me many days to get it all done, and I come back and work at its vest again, or its shirt, and I paint a lot of with washes. So for instance, when I talk about painting, I'll talk about my cedar waxwing. That has about a dozen different washes on it. So I'm painting it about 12 times to get it complete. So you're painting the bird over and over and over, building up that color and variation. So when you're trying to figure out what your color you want, and this is more critical when you're doing birds or something like that, you're trying to get exactly what you're looking for. When you finally get the right mixture, you make a little chart like this and write down what different paint you use to get there, and if you used a whole bunch of one paint and just a dab of another one or whatever, keep track of that. Because for me, the next day I got to go back and match this to finish painting it, another coat on it and stuff. So you do a paint chart, I guess that's what you call it. This is a Josh Googie one, just to give you an idea, for a laser bunting. And he sends out with that painting chart that's stuck in here someplace. And so it'll look something like this, a little bit more fancy. I just kind of scribbled all over my sheet. And I keep these so if I ever go back I can got them. Okay, sealer and primer. There's a lot of different variations on what artists, carvers do. I've read a lot of articles. They don't do none of it. Some will do a little bit of one or the other. Again, going back to Frank Schultz, this is what he uses to seal his bird carvings with. I had to order this. I don't know if this is better than something around here or not. It's a dry primer sealer. I figured if Schultz used it on his gorgeous birds, which I admire his ability, it's got to be good enough for me. Anyway, the other thing a lot of people do, including myself, is use gesso. Gesso is kind of a primer. So if you're painting a house or something, you need to prime the house first to get the paint to stick to the siding. That's kind of what a gesso is. Once in a while I see artists use gesso as a white paint, which is okay. It's a little duller type of a white than the regular white acrylic. But anyway, what a lot of artists do, if they do a gesso it, puts a sealer around it and it gives a nice background where you're putting your paint on. Some birders I've seen where they'll take gesso and put a little a brown mixture in there because the bird is mostly brown and it's not as colorful, so it gives a little bit better of that type of a background of the paint that you see through. So, but I've had gallons of this. So I think most artists, if you see them painting on a canvas, they'll paint that canvas completely with a gesso first. So that's where gesso comes from. Mediums, I'm not much of an expert of mediums, but there's lots of different varieties of mediums. They do different things. This is probably the one I use as much as any. Not that I use it much, it's a flow improver. So when you're doing, for me, when I'm trying to do some delicate little work and I need that paint to come off my paintbrush a little smoother or make sure all the little details, I'll put a couple of drops this in my mixture of that paint and hopefully it comes off my brush a lot smoother. And there's gloss mediums, satin type or matte type ones. There's other things that do other things what you can do mix in with your paint. So just be aware there's lots of variations that you can do out there. Okay. Give you a little background on black. What black is best? There are basically 3 kinds of black. And I do have a little, there's ivory black. Originally that was made from ivory, which they don't do anymore. So they actually burn bones to get that black instead of ivory. And I can pass this around. This is what my wife did. It's got different combinations along with blue on here. There's a carbon black, which is pure carbon. Used to be called lamp black. So years ago they take the carbon off of a lamp to make their pigment. Now they use pure carbon to do that. And the third one is Mars black. You might see that. That's derived from oxidation of metallic iron. But what she did here was to give you an idea if it made any difference. Here's a gesso sheet and what it looks like if you paint on that. This part was some type of a spray-on primer, and then over here is just the raw wood. So you can see if it made much difference in your end products or not. Okay, so what happens if you add a little white or black to your color? It's going to change the brightness or not. My own advice is go very slow. If you got a red and you want to just to kind of dull it up a little bit and you want to put some black, put a tiny amount, mix it. I've done that and I think, oh my gosh, this is just a dab of it, and it was way too much. So my advice is when you do that, go very slow, keep on adding till you get to whatever you're looking for. As I mentioned before, I went from putting on the heavy, straight out of the tube paint to washes, and washes are basically taking your color you want and diluting it with water until it's like a thin tea. Now, if it's a thin tea, you're going to put a lot of layers on it to build it up. I probably don't get quite that ambitious to make it quite that thin, but even though, like I said, I'm sure this bird has at least 12 different washes over it. The other advantage of doing that, you can build it up. You don't make as easy mistakes. You can even it out. On here, if you look at birds, in certain parts you want to get a little bit of a little darker or a little bit lighter to give it some life to it, so you can kind of put some easy washes on it and you don't have that harsh edges. It kind of blends in, so that helps a lot. So I don't know if you want to look at this or not. You can kind of see how it varies a little bit. And again, that's got at least 12 washes on it to get to that end product.
And you started it with gesso?
Gesso
over the whole
underneath,
thing?
yeah. Now, not all mine is gesso underneath, but I would say about 75% of my carvings are probably got gesso underneath them first.
If you want the wood grain to show through, you wouldn't then?
No.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, you don't want, yeah. And then, again, I would use washes. You could use a little bit heavier wash so you don't have to put quite so many coats on it, but until you get the right consistency, what you want. But that'll kind of make it, oh yeah, you can tell it's a wood carving instead of a plastic carving or something. You know? So I guess that's kind of what I end up doing with my little guy. I mean, you get thick enough, you don't know if this is a piece of plastic or wood in a sense, and I think having something like this with more washes, you can see through that. Oh yeah, I can tell that it's got color, but you also can tell that it's wood. For me, I like that better. I'm doing that's trying to be realistic color, like birds or something, then I gesso for sure. So you just keep on building that. So if you do, the other thing when you do washes, you don't get that shiny glare to it like when you do straight pigment. So it gives a little better dullness to it. I don't know if many of you heard of dry brushing, which is a very interesting thing for certain things. This is one of the memory hearts. It's got a lot of gouge grooves in it, and if you take your brush a fairly big one, something like this here, dip it straight into, like on this one, the white paint, brush most of that paint off, then hold it flat and just goes over the top edges, and you get something like that. Which is kind of neat. Where you also want to use it, that's another reason I brought this little guy, is if you're doing something like this and you want to put a little gray marks in his mustache or hair, you can do the same thing, either white or gray, and you just hit the top edges of it a little bit to give a little bit of a effect of the gray beard. So that's what they call dry brushing. The other thing I don't have an example of, and you probably don't use it too often, but I've done it on memory hearts, is and what I suggest is, what I do is practice this on a piece of paper first, dip this into fairly straight paint, you don't want to water it down too much, and then you just kind of splatter it on your object or practice paper, and you get splattered paint, which maybe that's what you want to do. So it's another little trick. Is what do you do when you do, oops, I got paint over where I don't want that paint? If it's already been painted, take a clean brush, don't use it, either clean out the brush that you just used, make sure it's clean, or get another brush, get it wet, dry it, don't get most of that water out so it's still wet but not full of water, and you can basically just lift that part of that paint that got over off the scarf and on his shirt or something. You can take it right off. Might have to do that, clean off your brush, do it again, but it's amazing you can correct your mistakes sometimes. So what I did was, you can read these, like for instance, this is what a typical sealant of 50% linseed oil, 50% mineral spirit, and a dab of burnt umber looks like if you want to seal your carving that way. So it gives a little depth to it, brings out the grain of the basswood. I'll just go through these real quick and you can look at them. Beeswax is another one that is used a lot. Okay, what does beeswax look like if you put it on? So in this square, which you can't even hardly see, is beeswax. And this one is just this sealant that I talked about. So what does that do if that's all you do, compared to the outer edge, which is the basswood? So here's one that's not sealed, but I got gesso on it. Here's a sealed one with gesso on it. So what does gesso on top of a sealed one looks like, if it makes any difference or not? Then on here, you have to look on the back of these. One's transparent and the other one's opaque. So that's why I got a black line in there. How does it show through? Here's one wash with opaque and transparent. Does it make much difference? Here's 6 washes. How does that vary? So it's kind of handy when you're a year or two later, oh, I want to do this and I can't remember what it looks like. Here's a sealed one with gesso and 6 washes. And again, it tells you what paint's on the back of them. Here's a sealed gesso with only 1 wash. Probably goes along with that one. Sealed gesso and the heavy coat, you know, that's the straight coat. So can you see, this is where you can really see the transparent versus the opaque, how that affects the underline. Here's just a heavy coat. Here's a sealed with wipe-on poly and 1 coat of acrylic. I always have trouble chip carving and then get them bleeding. And the bottom line, I think, is what Charlene recommends, put about 3 coats of poly on it, not just 1. So 1 helps, but I think 3 does it. This is the same, but with watercolor. I've done some chip carving and I filled them in with watercolor, which is kind of neat, a little bit different color. not sealed, and 1 coat of acrylic, not sealed, and 1 coat of soluble wax paste. I know some don't put anything over their carvings. Others will take something like this clear finish and put a very, very light coat. And their reasoning for that is you can dust it, keep the dust off a little bit, preserve it a little bit better. You don't want a very heavy coat, just a light coat. So that's one way. Another one that Josh Gooby does a lot on his birds and stuff, sometimes you want to just dull that up just a teeny bit, and he'll do a very, very, very light of a burnt umber wash over the bird just to kind of dull it a little bit, because you don't want it, for some birds you don't want it bright. But if you've gone down to Columbia like I have, they have beautiful, colorful birds. There's nothing brown down there at all. It's all the colors of the rainbow down there. So